Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people around the world. This is Martin Hubel, your host of the Db2Night show. This week it's the ZOS edition, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest with us this week, Håkan Roberts, the distinguished engineer from the IBM Silicon Valley Lab. How are you today, Håkan?
I'm very well, thank you, Martin.
Great. Hope you haven't got the snow that we have here in Toronto. We got on Wednesday we set a record snowfall for the end of February. But
God dearie me, no, it's dry and sunny and warm here in California, as most people would probably expect.
As if it isn't always like that.
No, that's very true. But unfortunately, I think this past winter has been unusually dry, drier than last year's.
Yeah, that can give you a problem in the summertime with fires and other.
Indeed, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I agree.
All righty, well, let's move along and do a show. Here we go. This is our social media page. Notice that I've added something new here at the bottom. We now have our replays available on YouTube. They've been there for some time, but if you don't feel like downloading a big file and you just want to watch the show, you can watch it from the replay blog, because there's a little window there, or you can go over to YouTube and watch it there. You'll be able to follow the link from the replay of this show. Disclaimers, as always, there they are. You can read it. Trademarks belong to respective organizations. We record things and we make the replays available. And we're glad you're here. Thanks very much. And there's our other agenda for today. And here are our upcoming shows. Next time I see you, actually, it's as early as next week. If you're interested in Db2 Pure Scale on Db2 LUW, Toby Haynes, the main man from the IBM Toronto lab, will be presenting new developments on that show. So if you're interested in Pure Scale, you've come to the right place next week, same time. On the Z side, we have Julian Stuhler next month on the 20th, and then we have our All About iDoug show and other shows lined up all the way to June, so it's going to be a great year. Also, DVI Software is our founding sponsor of the Db2Night show, and they have a demo of their products available on their website. There's a link. If you watch it, they'll send you a gift card. That's worth doing. Our winner last week of an Amazon card was Craig Richardson of Navy Federal. Congratulations to Craig. And life is good. You can be a winner on the Db2Night show. And our sponsors are DBI and yours truly, Martin Hubel Consulting, Inc. And I was just going through with Håkan how long I've been doing this. This is, I think, the 76th show I've done for Db2 on Z. So it's been a little while now. Once again, being as a Db2 Z show, this is a DVI Main Screen they have for a new version of their product that is being released soon. And rather than having a commercial break in the middle of the show, I'll just show you this. If you're interested again, sign up for the demo and be rewarded and learn a little bit more about how you can manage Db2 LUW performance. Now we have a couple of polls for you. I'll just pop those out of my command or control panel here, and it's really amusing. Where did I put them? Let's see. Oh, there they are. No matter how much I use the software, I can always use it wrong. It's a gift. So, what's your highest version of Db2Z in production? And give people a chance to answer that. I think we're seeing good news today, Håkan. Everybody seems to. We still got one person on Db211.
Okay, very good.
But on the whole, most of the audience has voted, and we have 1/3 of our audience is on Db2 version 12. function level 500 or higher. So that's good news. And,
very good.
Yeah, and
I'm assuming everybody is aware that version 11 is going out of support at the third quarter of this year.
Yikes! Yeah, they better get going. And the next thing is just a little bit on how long have you worked with Db2? I'd like to see how experienced your audience is. This is my 35th year. Golly. I think I'd find something better to do, like playing trombone. And there we've got that signed up. I'll close that and share the results. And our audience is also, they're senior, very senior, and really very senior. And that's what we have in our audience today. So with that, I should be putting a joke in or a picture of my dog. I'll do that eventually. But I was busy all week, so I didn't get a fun comment in. But so what I'll do instead is just turn things over to you, Håkan. Here we are. And I'll make you the presenter.
Okay.
And should have that little pop-up on the screen. I see that you do. I can see your screen, and as soon as you put, there you go. We're ready to go. I will mute myself, and I'll monitor the question queue. And if there's anything of import, I'll break in and tell you about it.
Great. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. Normally, the utilities presentations that I tend to give are talking about new enhancements that are being delivered in the utilities suite for Db2 for ZOS. But I thought I'd take a step back in this particular case and provide everybody with some general information and hints and tips on how to get the most out of your utilities, because quite often in talking to customers, I talk about new enhancements that we've delivered in the last 12, 18, 24 months, but it turns out that there are often some misconceptions regarding existing functionality that has been available for a number of years. So this is a session which provides you with some best practices, hints and tips for how to get the most out of the utilities that you've got today, rather than focusing upon what's been delivered, last month or what we're planning on delivering in 2020. So the usual disclaimer here that I'll skip over. And the agenda for this session is going to be, first of all, a set of general recommendations, and then I'm going to look at various utility areas. So copy, recover, load, unload, reorg, run stats, check, and then if there's time at the end, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some enhancements that we've made specifically for customers who use DSM on copy to move data around. We've made some improvements in Db2 in the engine as well as in the utilities to improve that process and make it more robust. All right, in terms of general recommendations, first of all, the first thing I want to say is that new function, performance, and availability improvements are things which we continue to deliver via PTFs in Db2 utilities. And it's something which we've done for many years, even before version 12 continuous delivery. I mean, arguably, the utilities suite was on a continuous delivery model before the rest of the Db2 engine was. And some of those enhancements are delivered tied to a function level in version 12. Some of them are actually just made available through the PTF, and you apply the PTF and you get the function immediately without actually having to activate any new function level. So the general recommendation, of course, is that newer versions of Db2, I mean, version 12 of Db2 is better than version 11 in terms of utility, usability, and function and performance and availability characteristics. And of course, newer maintenance levels are better than older maintenance levels. In terms of understanding what's available to you, I would recommend that you keep an eye on recent enhancements that have been delivered in Db2 utilities through the 2 URLs that I have at the bottom here. And also in the middle, we have a Db2 for ZOS News from the Lab blog, which you can look at. And obviously, these URLs are not utility specific, but every time we deliver a new feature in Db2 utilities, we would update these URLs and these websites in order to notify you of that. And keeping up with these things is, I would argue, is important because some of these improvements are really significant and can make a big difference to your lives as a DBA. And a lot of the time they tend to fly under the radar. So if we deliver some new improvement in a PTF, then you just apply the PTF, and most of the time you may be unaware of what that enhancement is. If it's a new feature in Db2 with a new external, then there'll be a ++ hold for a doc change. But if you're applying 200 PTFs in RSU 1909, for example, then oftentimes these types of ++ holds simply get lost. So looking at these URLs, looking at these websites is a very good way of keeping up with what's going on and what we're delivering, and then allowing you to take advantage of the new features which we continue to deliver in Db2 utilities. All right, so moving on then to some general recommendations. First thing I want to say is that in the past, I would be the first to admit that we had a number of default settings for our utilities which did not actually make sense. They might have made sense maybe 10, 15 years ago, but they don't make sense anymore. And so we had a concerted effort in version 12 of Db2 to go and improve those defaults. And so now generally, the defaults are generally recommended that we have. That doesn't mean to say that you can forget about all of the utility parameters that you've got specified, because there are certain areas where the default, even though we might consider it to be best practice, simply doesn't apply to your particular scenario. And then the other thing to say is that with respect to this presentation itself, I'm not going to worry about spending time on just basic recommendations, which I simply assume that people are familiar with, and I'm not going to be covering this session. So for example, my expectation is that the vast majority of reorgs that are being run with option share level change, which means that it's an online reorg. Your data is read-write for 99.9% of the time. Similarly for the copy utility and run stats and so on. I don't think there are many people out there who are running run stats without share level change, and incurring an application outage for gathering statistics on a particular table. Along the same lines, I'm not going to make general statements regarding utilities parallelism. Obviously, if you're interested in improving elapsed time, then ensuring that you optimize parallelism is extremely important. Also, when you're running utilities like the load utility, taking an inline copy is important in order to avoid leaving the object in copy pending at the end of it, and again, incurring or elongating an application outage if you do so. Putting work data sets on disk, not on tape, I think is something which most people would think makes perfect sense. And then sort number elimination. This is something which we delivered a number of years ago, and our expectation again is that customers would be taking advantage of this, and I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time discussing it. But the general idea here is that the utilities require sort work data sets for sort processing, and with sort number elimination, we tell the utility that it should look at real-time statistics and other information to determine how much sort workspace should be allocated to the job. So our expectation is that the Z-palms are set in such a way, in fact, the Z-palms that govern this are now default. But our expectation is that you're using sort num elimination and not specifying a sort num value or even hard-coded sort work data sets, unless there is some rare exception that requires you to do so. Right, so, for example, you've got a table with 5 rows in it, and you dsm1 copy into that table space, you know, 1 billion rows. Then, of course, the real-time statistics information doesn't know about what you've done with dsm1 copy, so we would look at RTS and it would say that there are only 5 rows in the table, when, of course, there are now 1 billion. So in that situation, you would either have to go and modify the RTS information in order to tell the utility not to rely upon RTS anymore, or you would actually go and specify a sort num parameter because we simply can't trust the information that Db2 knows about with respect to the amount of data contained within the table. Okay. The other thing I want to say regarding general recommendations is quite often I have people ask me, you know, what's up with the performance of the unload utility or the copy utility, run stats, whatever it happens to be, and looking at it, the reason for the elapsed time degradation is simply that Db2 Utilities is not able to take full advantage of sequential prefetch. And as I think everybody is aware, Utilities uses Db2 buffer pools, and for a number of utilities, we are scanning through the data and reading those pages into the Db2 buffer pools, and we use prefetch for that, and the utilities can prefetch up to 128 pages at a time. But that prefetch quantity is dependent upon whether your VP SEQT times the buffer pool size is greater than or equal to 80,000 buffers. So if the sequential prefetch threshold essentially means that we've got over 80,000 buffers available in the buffer pool for prefetch, then we can use the maximum prefetch quantity. If it's less than that, then we will ratchet down on that prefetch quantity within utilities. So where this typically comes up is customers running a benchmark, and what's happening is that the tests that are being run on a test Db2 system that's got a tiny Db2 buffer pool. And if it's got a tiny Db2 buffer pool, we're not going to see the same type of sequential prefetch that one would see in a production environment, for example, where a larger buffer pool is allocated. So I just want to make everybody aware of this. And if you want to maximize prefetch and improve utility performance, then larger buffer pools or potentially increasing VP SEQT would be the way to go. All right. So now I want to say a few words regarding PBGs. And PBGs obviously in the context of running utilities, because there are some unique characteristics to PBGs that I just want to make everybody aware of. First of all, there's no partition parallelism for reorging of a PBG. If I've got a PBR or a classic partition table space that's got 100 partitions and I reorg it, you would expect that the reorg utility would be unloading and reloading partitions in parallel. That doesn't work with PBGs. And the reason why it doesn't work with PBGs is because there is no actual partitioning scheme for it. So if you reorg a PBG that's got 100 partitions, we will unload that data sequentially, and then we will start reloading it from partition 1. And the reason for that, of course, is that we want to shuffle the data up to the start of the PBG table space. So at the end of it, you might be reorging a PBG table space with 100 partitions, but at the end of that reorg, all that data might fit into the first 5 partitions, and now the remaining 95 partitions at the end are now empty. And of course, as I think most people will now know, the reorg utility has the ability to physically delete those 95 empty PBG partitions if you want to prune them off now. But there's no reorg partition parallelism for PBGs. Secondly, there's no load or unload partition parallelism either. There's no concept of loading partition 5 of a PBG table space, because you have no real control over what data resides within partition 5 versus partition 6 or partition 4. From version 12 of Db2, we now support growing a new partition, even if you're reorging a subset of partitions. So before version 12, if I've got a PBG with 10 partitions and I want to reorg partition 4, you can do it. You can just reorg that partition 4. But if I'm reorging partition 4, all that data's got to fit back into partition 4. And there's an excellent chance that the data is not going to fit back into partition 4 because partition 4 was actually full to begin with. And so we were trying to, Reorg Utility is trying to reinstate percent free and free page settings, and now there's no way that data is going to fit back into partition 4 from whence it came. So in order to solve that problem prior to version 12, you would reorg a larger set of partitions, which would allow the reorg utility to move rows across those partitions that are being reorged, or ultimately just reorg the entire PBG table space in one go. And if you reorg the entire PBG table space, that of course means that now the reorg utility can grow additional partitions if it needs to spill over to some new partitions later on. Well, in version 12 of Db2, we now support that for subsets of partitions. So now, if I want to reorg partition 5, and the data doesn't fit back into partition 5, the reorg utility has a license to go and add a new partition at the end and spill over into a new partition at the end. And incidentally, as a result of this enhancement, we've removed a ZPARM to simplify ZPARM processing in Db2. And this is a ZPARM called Reorg Ignore Free Space, which basically said that if you set this and you're reorging a subset of PBG partitions, then we would ignore your percent free and free page settings and treat them as if they were 0, in order to try to ensure that the data fits back into the partition that it came from. I already talked about the ability for the reorg utility to drop and delete empty PBG partitions. And that was governed by a ZPARM in version 11. And now in version 12, you're able to specify that through a reorg parameter called dropPart. Bear in mind that there's no support for point-in-time recovery of the PBG table space to a time prior to a reorg that deletes empty PBG partitions. And incidentally, deleting PBG partitions can only be done through a table space level reorg for PBGs. Okay, you can't have 100 partitions in a PBG and reorg partition 100 and have partition 100 removed. And finally, on this slide, reorg of multiple partitions of a PBG that reorg is going to default to AUX yes, and it's going to pull in lob table spaces if you have any lob columns on that table that resides within the PBG. Okay, and that can be expensive processing because the reorg utility, you want to reorg the PBG table space, but the reorg utility has now got to drag in all of the associated lob table spaces, because if we end up moving rows between partitions of the PBG, we have to move the lobs between partitions as well. So we will not do this if you specify awks no explicitly on the reorg, and we will not do it by default if the PBG is max partitions 1. I mean, if the reorg is, if the PBG is max partitions 1, it cannot grow beyond a single partition. And so the reorg is smart enough to say there's no need. There's no need to pull in any lob table space here because no rows are going to be moving. But I just want to point out here that if max partitions is 5, and yet you only have a single PBG partition, that's not sufficient, and we would pull in the lob table spaces in that instance, or the lob table space, the lob table spaces, depending on how many lob columns you have defined on the table. All right. So now on to utilities proper here, and I'm going to start with a copy utility. And the first thing I want to say, this is a really important point that I want to get across to everybody, and that is that in version 10 of Db2, we deliver support for dataset level flash copy in utilities, and as part of that, we delivered the ability for copy share level change to create a transaction consistent image copy dataset. So a transaction consistent image copy dataset without any application impact, whilst your applications continue to update the data. And the syntax for that is copy flash copy consistent. So one might reasonably assume that if you do not have flash copy support, you cannot create transaction consistent image copies. That's not true. You don't need flash copy support. You don't need to purchase flash copy support in order to create transaction consistent image copies in Db2 using the copy utility. It will still work. It will take longer to run because we can't take a native flash copy, but at the end of it, you will still have a transaction consistent image copy dataset. Note also that if you create these transaction consistent image copies, then recovering from them will work fine, but recovery from a transaction consistent image copy can in fact take longer. And the reason for that is that in order to create the transaction consistent image copy in the first place, we might have to roll back uncommitted units of work that were in flight at the time the copy was taken. So that means that on the recovery, we cannot just lay down the image copy and start the log apply from that point onwards. We have to lay down the image copy and potentially go further back in the log to replay log records during the log apply phase of the recovery. So the message there is, if you need transaction consistent image copies, great. If you don't need them, don't just take them for fun, because your recovery time may end up being longer as a result. Next point I want to make is, if you don't take incremental image copies, if you're not interested in incremental image copies, then alter your page sets to track mod no. Because by altering your page sets to track mod no, it means that during application modifications of your data, there's no need for Db2 to maintain modified page flags, so-called dirty bits in spacemap pages. That then can reduce the overhead for your applications. The next thing to say is that as of some time now, flash copy to an XRC primary, if you're using XRC DASI mirroring, now flash copy to an XRC primary volume is supported. That's something which a number of customers who want to take advantage of flash copy have been waiting for some time. Use a large block interface for better copy performance when you're writing to tape. Have a look at the tape block size limit in the dev XX parameter in member in sys1.parmlib. And consider taking image copies of large indexes. If you have something go wrong with an index, then for very large tables, recovering that index is likely to be a lot faster than rebuilding that index. And this becomes particularly important if you're performing a recovery of the data as well. For example, a point-in-time recovery of the data. Because if you need to rebuild an index afterwards, that rebuild of the index cannot start until the recovery of the data has completed. So it makes much more sense in that instance from an availability perspective to just image copy the indexes and just include them in the same recovery. Because once that recovery is finished, your data and your indexes are now available. That's better than completing the recovery of the data and then having to wait another 2 hours for the rebuild of the index to complete. Second to last bullet here is leave the buff_no parameter alone, just let the utility choose the default value. And finally, as I already mentioned on a previous slide, you really want to think about maximizing prefetch quantity in order to gain faster performance for the copy utility. Now on this slide here, slide 9, just a very quick point here. This lists the various backup solutions that are available to you, including, if you really wanted to, just saying, I'm not going to use Db2 backups, I'm going to take volume level backups, use DS1 copy, whatever you want to do. Not particularly recommended as your main backup strategy for Db2, I would say, but I included it here for completeness sake nonetheless. The main choices would be backup system for volume level flash copy backups. The one that still prevails massively is sequential image copies that have been a tried and trusted solution since version 1.1 of Db2. And of course, the ability now to take flash copies rather than sequential image copies at individual object levels since version 10 of Db2. And the reason why I mention this is because of the last bullet here, where I've had questions from numerous customers who have said, okay, I can see that Db2 Utilities is continuing to improve its flash copy support. Are sequential image copies going to be going away? You know, do we in IBM envisage a point at which we will no longer support sequential image copies and basically force people down the flash copy path? And the answer to that is no. We do not envisage that at all. So all of these options will continue to be supported. We will continue to improve our flash copy support and our backup system and restore system support for those customers who are interested in it. And, you know, flash copy has got some great advantages. But we are not going to be removing support for sequential image copies. Okay. Now, following on from the copy utility, let's talk a little bit about the recover utility. So the main thing about the recover utility is that, in general, the duration of it is the time it takes to restore the backup and then perform any additional log apply. And so for most customers, when you're running a recovery, what really matters is how do I speed it up? Okay, how do I make sure that the elapsed time of the entire recovery is as short as possible? Because if you're running a recover, chances are somebody somewhere is beating you up, wanting to know when their data is going to be back online and their application is going to be back online. So of course, you know, an obvious thing to do would be if you're spending 6 hours in log apply, maybe you should think about taking more frequent image copies or taking incremental image copies. But another thing that you could consider is in fact using flash copy, because flash copy could massively improve the time it takes to restore the dataset, assuming the flash copy dataset, the flash copy image copy is on disk. If the flash copy image copy has been migrated by HSM onto tape, then there is no automatic recall of that by HSM. And the recover utility will skip those migrated flash copy image copies and fall back to some equivalent or earlier sequential image copy. So you need to be careful about taking flash copy image copies and having them migrated onto tape. If you did that, and you needed to recover from that flash copy, you would have to recall it first before invoking the recover utility. There are planned improvements in this area, but this is current behavior that I'm talking about now. Next, maximize, in order to improve log apply performance, other than, of course, taking more frequent image copies and potentially incremental image copies, would be to maximize the exploitation of the parallel restore and the fast log apply process. So if I've got 50 page sets to recover, just recover them in a single job. There are multiple objects in a list in parallel, which the recover utility can do, and then allow the recover utility to take full advantage of fast log apply, which has existed since version 6 of Db2. But that means that ideally you're processing less than 100 objects or partitions in a single recover, and ideally no more than 51 separate recover jobs per Db2 subsystem. So you could potentially think about splitting these recoveries across multiple members of the data sharing group. The second to last bullet addresses an idea here where if I've got two table spaces that need to be recovered, one of those table spaces might have had no updates to it, and the other one might have had numerous updates to it. So the first table space, once we've completed the restore of the image copy, we will have a look in syslog_range, and we will see that there are no logs to be applied, and that recovery can finish then. And you can make that data available to your applications at that point in time. The second table space, however, we can't make it available until we've completed all of the log apply processing that needs to be done for it. So if you recover both of those objects in a single recover statement, now neither of those objects will be available until the entire recovery is completed. So for those objects that have no updates, that you know have no updates, if you want to make those available sooner, consider splitting them off into a separate recover. And then the last point is, if you've got thousands of objects that need to be recovered, you need to start thinking about ruthlessly prioritizing what objects really, really are critical from an application perspective, and process those first. A quick word about point-in-time recovery and some of the unique characteristics associated with that. As I already mentioned, think about image copying indexes and then including them in the recovery list. Because if you're recovering data to current, we don't leave indexes in rebuild pending. But if you're recovering your data to a prior point in time, the associated indexes will be left in rebuild pending. And you then have to wait for the rebuild of those indexes to occur before your applications have full access to the data. So it might make sense to image copy those indexes and just include them in the recovery list with the data. You're not left in rebuild pending at the end of it. Once that recovery is completed, you're back to normal. Next, consider using scope updated and also the back out yes parameter. And there's no real link between those two. But scope updated basically says, I want to recover to an hour ago. Maybe there have been no updates to the data in the intervening hour, so we can actually skip that point in time recovery. Back out yes says, I want to recover to an hour ago. Maybe it makes sense to just roll back on the log from the current point in time, 1 hour, as opposed to restore an image copy from a week ago and roll forward a week's worth of log data. Next, include the whole RI set in the same recover statement. If you don't, then the recover utility will have to figure out what to place in check pending, because you're doing a point-in-time recovery of a subset of an RI set. So that means you're introducing an RI inconsistency amongst the RI set, and the recover utility will place objects in check pending at the end of it. Similarly, include space and aux objects in the same recover statement, because if you recover a base without its associated log table space or XML table space to a prior point in time, or vice versa, then we would place you in aux check pending, because you've now potentially introduced an inconsistency. And finally, along the same lines, if you happen to know what you're doing, if you really understand your data well, then you can use the options enforce no and verify set no to reduce the outage duration and cut down on the amount of work that the recovery utility has to do. Because enforce no means that we will not set check pending or aux check pending, even if you don't include the entire RI set or or log table space or XML table space. And verify set no says that the recovery utility can run even though those related objects are not included. Okay, so this allows you to do a point-in-time recovery of a subset of an RI set, or just the base, or just the log, without the corresponding related page sets. And enforce no can actually significantly speed up the point-in-time recovery process, because it tells the recovery utility, I know what I'm doing. I'm just recovering this one table. I don't care about the rest of the RI set. I know I'm not going to be introducing any RI inconsistencies. And the recovery utility then does not need to even figure out what the RI set is in order to determine what to place in check pending or even in aux check pending. All right, moving on to slide. So load and unload utilities. For load replace, the recommendation that I would give is, and this is something we delivered just a couple of years ago, is to use share level reference. And up to a couple of years ago, we only had share level none. But now for load replace, we support share level reference that allows you to that allows you to do a load replace into a shadow, and then we will drain and switch at the end of the load. So that means that if that load were to fail, for some reason, we would not need to leave you in recover pending at the end of it. So it's a huge, and of course, because we're running share level reference and not share level none, it's a massive availability improvement anyway. Sort dev T, it's a bit unintuitive, I'd be the first to admit, but sort dev T parameter governs parallel index build for the load utility. Next, if your input data, if you're loading multiple partitions for a range partition table space, then, and your input data can be split up by partition, then do that and drive partition parallelism, because it's likely to be quicker than using a single input data set with the parallel option. The exception to that, as I say here, is if there's a lot of data skew. If I want to load 10 partitions and I've got a single input data set, and I split that single input data set into 10 separate data sets, but 99% of the data actually belongs to partition 1, then splitting that data up into 10 separate data sets and driving partition parallelism isn't going to save you very much, because 99% of the processing is against partition 1. And in that particular instance, the parallel option with a single input data set is likely to perform better. But in general, for a relatively even distribution of data across partitions, partition parallelism is going to be more efficient. For online load share level change, use the parallel keyword, because that's going to allow the load utility to drive parallel inserts into a single page set. And it's going to be much, much faster in terms of elapsed time. If your input data set is on tape or its variable length, then the best thing to do is to tell the load utility how much data is being loaded, so that we can then estimate the amount of workspace that's required. And in the past, we had a sort keys parameter that you could specify. But now, as of some years, we've got a numRex parameter, which is much more intuitive, where you just tell us roughly how many rows, how many records you're going to be loading, and we will then use that information to estimate the amount of workspace that's required for the load itself. For load resume, we now support the taking of inline image copies as part of that load. So you can avoid leaving the object in copy pending or the need for a separate copy step at the end of the load. If you're loading data into a table that's got log or XML columns, or you're unloading from a table with log or XML columns, don't use file reference variables, which is the original solution that we had for this. Instead, use the span yes option, which will allow the load and unload utility to use variable block span for the sysrec dataset. It's vastly faster than using file reference variables. In version 12 of Db2, there's a new register no option for the unload utility, which means that in data sharing, as we read pages into the local buffer pool, we don't need to register them with the coupling facility. That can dramatically cut the data sharing overhead for the unload utility, and incidentally for runstats as well, because it's an option on runstats also. It depends, of course, whether you're interested in unloading data, but you don't necessarily need to see the very latest data from the table. Because, of course, since we're not registering pages with a group buffer pool in the coupling facility, it may be that the pages that we read in and unload from in the local buffer pool do not contain the very latest data. So depending upon the nature of the unload, you could use the register no option in order to dramatically reduce data sharing overhead. And finally, if your table is partitioned by date or timestamp, consider using the copy dictionary option on the load utility in order to pre-allocate compression dictionaries to empty partitions that your applications haven't started inserting into. So this isn't really about loading data. This is about using the copy dictionary option in the load utility to copy a compression dictionary from a partition that already has data in it and has a compression dictionary in it, and moving that compression dictionary, copying that compression dictionary to an empty partition that your applications have not started inserting into. And that way, when your application starts inserting into that partition, you will get compressed data from the very first insert. Okay, a quick introduction to the reorg utility here, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with respect to the various phases. And the example here, of course, is using reorg share level change and the drain all parameter. And that is that we will start off with, just like every other utility, with util init phase. So this is utility initialization. Then we will unload the data from the original page set. We will then do a sort and load that data into the shadow. Once we've done that, now we need to catch up on the log and replay any log records for updates that we might have missed. So there's a log phase. Once we get towards the end of that log phase, then we will issue a drain to prevent any further updates or any further access to the page set. Once we've done that, we can now catch up that last little bit on the log, and then we enter the switch phase. And during that switch phase, because we've now drained everybody, now we can go ahead and switch the shadow with the original. Once we've done that, we've finished with it, we go and update the catalog in the directory. We then enter the utility termination phase, we release the drain, you're back to UTRW, and now the reorg utility completes. So that's the total duration of the reorg utility. What typically matters for most customers is not the total duration of the reorg itself. What really matters is the timing and the duration of the application outage. When am I going to get that drain, and how long is that drain going to last for? So Moving on to slide 14, there are actually two key parameters that govern outage duration. The first one is max RO, and this basically indicates the number of seconds of processing that we believe are remaining on the log before we actually attempt to do the drain. So this tells the reorg utility, right, I'm catching up on the log, on the end of the log during the log phase, and I'm doing this through numerous iterations, numerous log iterations. But eventually, I'm going to estimate that I'm so close to the end of the log, I've only got 10 seconds worth more of log processing to process. And if max RO is set to 10 or higher, that tells us, okay, now I can try to get the drain. And so at that point, we will try to get the drain. The second parameter says, once I request the drain, how long should I wait before I give up and maybe go back and try again? And that's the drain wait parameter. So that's the number of seconds that we would actually wait for the drain before we give up. And then there are retry parameters and retry wait parameters where you can say, wait 30 seconds and then go through the whole iterative process again. So those are the two key parameters. And using those two parameters, it's possible to manipulate the reorg utility processing in order to achieve a balance between getting the reorg to break in and ensuring the reorg completes and succeeds, and minimizing application impact. Because while we hold a drain, application threads trying to acquire a claim are going to have to wait. And eventually, those claims will time out based upon your IRL lock timeout interval. So in general, in order to minimize application impact from the reorg utility, you really want the drain wait time plus the max RO time to be something less than your IRL lock timeout interval. And that is one of the main recommendations that you have in the middle of this slide here. Other key recommendations would be to use drain all as a parameter, and that is now incidentally the default. Use timeout term so that if we time out, we will actually free up the objects. Retry equals 6, and then retry wait of drain wait times the number of retries that you allow. And then a last general recommendation would be to think about using max RO defer and either the alter utility command or the new switch time parameter if you need the reorg to complete within a short window. It might be that you have a very large table, but what really matters to you is that that drain occurs between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Well, with max RO defer, you could submit the reorg on Saturday morning. And max RO defer says, it doesn't really matter how long it takes to actually reorg the object. That reorg is just going to sit there in the log phase, keeping up on the log until you tell it that you want it to drain and switch. And that's what the alter utility command does, which you could schedule for 2 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Or you give it, or when you submit the reorg, you specify a switch time parameter of 2 p.m. Sunday afternoon with a new max RO value, which essentially guarantees that the reorg utility will acquire the drain at that time. And then the last bullet here is that flash copy, inline image copy, which of course we've supported since version 10 of Db2, that flash, if you take a flash copy, inline image copy on reorg, that would actually reduce the outage duration. Because after we've acquired a drain on the object and we're catching up on the log, there's more sequential inline image copy processing that has to be done. But if we're not relying upon sequential image copies, we can just take the flash copy during the switch phase and move on. And it's generally, it's going to be a lot quicker than handling potentially very large sequential image copies for very large objects that are being reorged. All right, a couple of other things to very quickly mention. Be careful using part level inline image copies to tape. at least until you get a solution in APAR PI 75518, which is an APAR that's still open at this point in time. But the issue here is that if you're taking part level inline image copies and they're going to tape, each of those inline image copy data sets have got to be open for write simultaneously. And if you're passing those to tape and you're reorging 1,000 partitions, that means you've got 1,000 separate inline image copy data sets, and that means you need 1,000 tape units available. And this becomes a particular issue, or can become a particular issue, with PBR-RPN, because PBR-RPN in version 12 of Db2 actually requires part-level inline image copies today. As I say, we have a solution plan for this in PI 75518, which is still open at this point in time. And then lastly, if you're interested in the force option for reorg, which allows the reorg utility to cancel threads that are blocking it from and preventing it from acquiring the drain, then take a look at APAR PH12240, which significantly improves the force option and allows it to cancel threads that are preventing it from getting the drain, even though those threads might not be executing in Db2 at the time. However, be careful using the force option. There are actually a couple of options with the force, a couple of options with the force parameter. One of them says only cancel those threads that haven't performed any updates. The other option is cancel any thread that's blocking me. Be a bit careful about that, because you might not want to cancel a thread that's been updating for 5 hours, because we've now got to wait for it to roll back for 5 hours worth of updates before it releases its claim anyway. All right, quick word about reorg index versus rebuild index, because some customers have said, you know, I want to reorg this index, but in actual fact, I found it a lot quicker to just rebuild the thing. And that may be, but be careful about using rebuild index instead of reorg index. And the main reason why I say that is because you can run rebuild index share level change, but looking at the syntax of that, you think this is fantastic. This means that I can rebuild the index with no application impact at all. That's not true. When you run rebuild index share level change, the data is in UTRW, so your data remains in read-write, but the index itself goes into rebuild pending. So there's no access to that index while it is being rebuilt. There's no concept today of rebuilding an index to a shadow. So from an availability perspective, reorg index is better than rebuild index. Also, reorg index can materialize schema changes, which rebuild index cannot. And another recommendation, however, with respect to rebuild index is if you want to create a new index on an existing table and it's a non-unique index, then a great solution which many customers use is to create the index defer yes, places the index in rebuild pending, but it's not a unique index, so it shouldn't impact your applications, and then run rebuild index shareable change, which basically ensures that that index is created and then built and made available with virtually no application impact at all. Doesn't work for unique indexes, but it's great for creation of new non-unique indexes upon existing tables. Okay, on to run stats on slide 18. First thing to note is don't bother using run stats to gather space statistics. We should have everything that we need in real-time statistics today. Secondly, use table sample system auto, which basically means that run stats will use page sampling rather than row sampling. So instead of sampling every third row on every page, we just sample every third page, for example. And auto means that the runstats utility and Db2 will determine the appropriate sampling rate based upon the size of the object. So you effectively get Db2 managed page sampling through table sample system auto. In fact, with Db2 version 12, function level 505, By default, we will override row sampling to this, unless you change the ZPalm that governs it. Next, don't bother running run stats on lob table spaces. There is no access path selection process for accessing lob data in the lob table space. It's not like you have numerous access paths for the optimizer to choose from. So don't bother running run stats on lob table spaces. RTS contains all the information you need about the size of lobs and so on and so forth, and can help you determine whether a reorg of a lob table space is required or not. Use stats profiles in version 12 of Db2. The future direction for run stats is use of statistics profiles, and that got enhanced significantly in version 12. And think about using the new register no option in version 12 of Db2 to avoid data sharing overhead. Again, run stats brings pages into the local buffer pool. With the register no option, you can avoid registering those pages with the group buffer pool, and thereby virtually eliminate data sharing overhead. But again, it only works for run stats share level change, and you have to decide just how current you need your data to be at the time run stats sees it. Moving on to slide 19, for the check utility, first thing to say about it is that we've supported check utilities, check data, check log, check index, share level change for a number of years now. But it relies upon flash copy. And if you do not have native flash copy support, then don't run check utilities share level change. In actual fact, there's a ZPalm that governs this, and the default is that if you do not have native flash copy, we will fail a check share level change, because share level change says you expect a certain level of data availability when you run this, and without the native flash copy support, we would not be able to provide that. If you run check utilities share level change and your object is in check pending or auth check pending, then the utility would not reset check pending or auth check pending. We're actually planning to take an APAR this year in order to address that and reset check pending or auth check pending, even though you run check share level change. And if you know your data well, then you can consider avoiding setting check pending or auth check pending in the first place by either on a point-in-time recovery using the enforce no option, which I mentioned before, or using no check pend as an option on either the load utility, existed on the load utility for a number of years, or more recently, we enhanced the reorg utility to allow you to specify no check pend for reorg discard processing as well. All right, on to slide 20. DSM1 copy, a quick word about DSM1 copy. Now, there are many customers who use DSM1 copy extensively as a cheap way of moving data around. But DSM1 copy itself is a standard, the DSM1 designation indicates that it's a standalone utility. It doesn't need Db2 to be up for it to be run. And it has no access to the Db2 catalog information. And it itself cannot ensure that the data matches the definition of the target. So it's entirely possible for you to DSM1 copy, from a source that's seg size 4 to a target that's seg size 32. Of course, Db2 is going to complain bitterly about it when you try to access data in that target table space afterwards. But DSM1 copy has no actual clue about it. So that's the first thing to note. Second thing is that all target datasets have to be pre-allocated for multi-piece table spaces. So if you have a multi-piece table space, then you have to make sure that you go and allocate the target data sets beforehand before you run the DSML copy. For XML, there's actually data-dependent information kept in the XML strings table in the Db2 catalog. So you can't DSML copy an XML table space from one Db2 system to an entirely different Db2 system, because the XML strings information in the catalog isn't the same. Next, in Db2 version 12, in order to prevent the type of problem that I mentioned at the start of this slide, where you're using DSML copy and the table schemas don't match, or the table space definition doesn't match, the problem with those types of problems is that in the past, the DSML copy would run successfully, and then you start Db2, and your application starts accessing the data in that table, and because of these inconsistencies between what the catalog and directory says and what's actually in the page set, you would end up with unspecified errors, including storage overlays, Db2 crashes, and so on and so forth. So in order to try to prevent this type of situation from occurring, in version 12 of Db2, we have enhanced our validation of the data in the page set at the time that page set is opened, and then report on any inconsistencies that we find and fail the page set open because something has gone wrong with the DSML copy process. You've DSML copied from an apple to an orange. And we will check both table space and table definitions for this. Now, that doesn't mean that that we can't handle table versioning correctly. What it means is that if you're copying from table space A to table space B, we expect the definition of table space A and table space B to be the same. And also, we expect that the current definition of the table or tables in table space A and table space B should be the same. But on your source table space, you might have a table that's been altered 5 times. And over on the target, you just go and create the target table to match the current schema definition according to the catalog for the source table. So that means that there's a mismatch between the table versioning information between the source and the target. But the new repair catalog utility has been created and updated to fix versioning information and also to validate for schema match and mismatches after a DSML copy has occurred. And here you can see an example of the type of information that you get from repair catalog, which is a massive improvement over what we had before with the repair versions utility. So you can see here, it's looking at table space, and it tells you that there's a mismatch, tells you exactly what the mismatch is. It tells you that we can't fix it because there are certain things that we can fix with repair catalog, but this particular thing cannot be fixed, and so the utility execution terminates, and we can't do anything about it. So you're basically going to have to go and fix this yourself because there's a problem with the way DSML copy was run in the first place. On to slide 22, just to complete what I was saying earlier on with respect to table versioning. Not only have we delivered improvements with repair catalog, but we've also made improvements in the Db2 engine itself to make Db2 page sets more self-describing. So now, even though a page set only contains version 0 records for a given table, we will store version 0 system page information in the page set to make it more self-describing. And that means that we now have a much more robust DSM copy solution than we had before. The repair utility, incidentally, has been enhanced in this regard with two new options in order to ensure that version 0 system page information is inserted into the page set. One of them is insert version pages, which will then insert any missing system pages for tables that are at version 0. And then the second one is set current version, that actually updates the catalog current version for all tables to the same number as the current version in this table space. And for further information about this, I've referenced two APARs where we delivered this additional capability here. So overall, with the version 0 support and the repair catalog support and repair support in general, we've made DSM copy much more robust now than it was before. Okay, so in summary, I've taken you through a number of guidelines and hints and tips with respect to utilities. But in general, just a few rules of thumb: stay reasonably current on maintenance in order to take advantage of new features, many of which you actually get for free without requiring any changes to any of your utility jobs. Keep up to date with utility enhancements. Check out the websites that I referred to at the start of this presentation. And then, when we have delivered an enhancement through some new option, go and revisit existing utility jobs to take advantage of the new options that we continue to deliver within the utility space. All right, and so that wraps up a run-through of hints and tips for the utilities. So, Martin.
Yes.
Back to you. Thank you.
Oh,
thank you,
awesome
everybody,
job.
for your time today.
Thanks so much. I'll just do the housekeeping to make sure we're doing everything we normally do as we end a show off. But what a great bit of information. Thanks for sharing with the DB2 community. And,
thank you. My pleasure.
And we'll just move that along. And the last question is, as always, did you learn something today? And actually, we picked up a few people that showed up a little late, and that was great. So we even have higher numbers than when we started. And that's a great thing.
Great.
And as it stands right now, we're getting the typical vote, which we'd like to see after a great show. People just have to find it if it's buried underneath. Sometimes people have another window open or something. But we have enough people to vote to be able to say 100% of our audience learned something.
I'm gratified and glad it's been a fruitful use of my time. Thank you.
It's always great to see that, Hakan, and thanks for your time and joining us today. And with that, seeing as we're slightly over time, but not too bad, I'll cue the music. Thank you one more time, and wish everyone a good weekend, and we'll see you next week for another DB2 LUW show, and we'll see you soon on March the 20th for our next DB2Z show. Best to all. Thanks again, Hakan. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.